Today, Birkhead is a ruined farm lying close to the old Caaf Reservoir to the west of Dalry in North Ayrshire. However, it has a history going back for at least half a millennium, much of it linked with the Craufurd family, originally from Craufurdland Castle in East Ayrshire. Over the centuries, this dwelling has had various names, such as Birkett, Birkhead, Birkhead, and also with tags such as Inner, Little, and Meikle. Some of the confusion may arise from the fact that the other end of the old Caaf Reservoir, going towards the west, there was a farm originally known as Steel, which means place with a woodland on a steep slope. And this was later named Birkheadsteel before being finally abandoned, demolished when the reservoir was built and flooded the site. The name derives from the Scots for a birch tree, which is birk, and head probably refers to a woodland. The birch tree is typical of this sort of highland area with poor quality ground and quite rough conditions. Birkhead has always been associated with the nearby farm of Giffordland. This was at one time a barony. A Norman family, had owned it, known as Gifford, but their line had ended with a female who could not inherit. As a result, the Crawfords, a cadet branch of the Craufurds of Craufurdland Castle, East Ayrshire, were able to obtain it. A cadet branch is where the first son would normally inherit the mansion, such as the castle, and the second son would be provided whatever property the family could afford. Giffordland, therefore, was at one time a manor house or a laird's house. The cadet branches would go off and form their own branch or lines of a family tree. At this time, land was held directly from the monarch, and in return they had to provide an armed soldier when called upon to do so. Two members of the family were lost, one the Battle of Pinkie, the other one the Battle of Flodden. In the 1540s, the owner of Giffordland, the Laird, had two sons. The eldest inherited Giffordland, but the second son, Thomas, inherited Birkhead, which meant that the barony had been split to provide him with some land to live on, which meant that he would have himself become a laird, and there would have been a laird's house. This seems to have been on the site of today's ruins of Birkhead Farm. In 1543, the lairds of both Giffordland and Birkhead were called upon by Mary Queen of Scots to come to her aid to fight their army at Coldingham. Coldingham is just inside the boundary of Scotland, and at the time there was the rough wooing taking place. This was when Henry VIII was making various excursions into Scotland to try and force Mary Queen of Scots to marry his son. They both faced the full force of the law for failing to attend and were probably heavily fined. Thomas and his descendants, John, Ninian, Andrew, William, and Alexander, and so on, seem to be what was called bonnet lairds. That is, they weren't rich enough to be entirely living as aristocrats. They had some physical part in running their estates. Most of the ruins of today's Birkhead Farm are clearly 19th century and are shown as such on the Ordnance Survey maps. However, part of it, the bit with the crow-step gables, appears to be much older, possibly going back as far as the 17th century. It seems to have been the laird's house for a number of centuries, clearly is much older than the rest of the farm, which the Ordnance Survey maps show to be from the 19th century. It has features such as tracery work around the windows and high-quality stonework, in addition to what has one time been quite a substantial fireplace. And these show that later a barn was built to attach to the back of it. And then in the 19th century, the farm, the ruins which still stand, mostly of cottages and of another barn, were built. The old cart shed clearly shows that when it ceased to be a laird's house, it was converted. So a large opening was made and a dividing wall was put in place, you can see that the dividing wall doesn't actually lock into the masonry at the front of the building. It may be that the last laird living there was a James Craufurd, Esquire of Birkhead. In 1765, his father had obtained the property from the Crawfords, so it may be that they were in some way related, although not a direct line. After this, the farm seems to be converted into a proper farm rather than an estate house, although it is referred to in some of the old maps as Birkett and is shown with a symbol of being a house up into the 1820s. In the 1850s, it was owned by a Mr. Stirrat and was referred to as being a farm with offices and with a pleasant garden. There are the remains of a lime kiln nearby. There's also still a spring that runs beside the farm. Other properties which have been associated with it over the years seem to be Wardlaw Farm and also Knock and Don, and they have previously mentioned and now demolished Birkheadsteel. The Ordnance Survey maps show that between the 1850s and about the 1900s, the farm steadily increased in size. At one point, there was a horse mill situated at the front. This would be a horse powering machine that would have an axle that would turn other machines, such as for milking and so on. However, it was this point that the farm went into decline. The Irvine District Water Board in 1906 seemed to have compulsorily purchased the land to build the Caaf Reservoir. This also led to the demise of Birkheadsteel Farm. In 1986, the council sold the land and the old farm to the tenants. Must have been cattle still being there because there was a milk quota involved. All the buildings have now lost their roofs. The old cottages are difficult to interpret in terms of they had lots of alterations. There have been doors that have been either completely or partly blocked up, and the far end seems to have been at one time a barn. There's a sign of an owl hole there. These were to allow owls to get in and nest and also to help keep down the vermin.